Recorded Books is pleased to present the Modern Scholar series, where great professors teach you. My name is Henry Strozier, and I'll be your host. Today we begin a course entitled Wars That Made the Western World: the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian War, and the Punic Wars. Your professor is Timothy B. Shutte of Kenyon College. Professor Shutte earned his B.A. in English Literature at Yale and his Ph.D. in Medieval Literature and the History of Ideas at the University of Virginia. Since 1986, Professor Shutte has taught at Kenyon College, where he has taught in the English department and in the college's unique integrated program in human studies, an interdisciplinary program which focuses on the great books of literature, philosophy, history, art history, religion, and science. In addition to numerous academic publications, Shutte has also written extensively on military history, baseball, and birding. The values of a civilization undergo their most intense trial by fire when they are exposed to the inferno of war. In the deadly battles between cities, states, and countries, ideas, beliefs, and virtues either collapse or emerge triumphant, as one culture overcomes or submits to another. The Western world, for all its history of bloody combat, was forged in its most fundamental particulars thousands of years ago in a series of wars that shaped and defined the civilizations of the Greeks and the Romans, and thus, in turn, molded and influenced the shape of our identity, even today, as Westerners. In this course, we'll examine the three pivotal engagements that most determined the early course of history. We'll look at the Persian Wars, fought between the Greek city-states and the massive Persian Empire; the Peloponnesian War, where the Greek city-states turned against each other; and finally, the Punic Wars, the apocalyptic series of conflicts between Carthage and Rome that ended with the emergence of Rome as a growing imperial power. For more information on this course, please visit its webpage at www.modernscholar.com, where you'll have access to links to related sites, a seminar room to share your thoughts with other students, and yes, of course, a final exam. And now we begin Wars That Made the Western World, Lecture 1, The Persian Wars, Greece and Persia, the opening rounds. And now, Professor Shutte.
Welcome to Wars That Made the Western World. In this course, we're going to take a look at three monumental contests that took place in antiquity. That is to say, BC, and pretty much every date that we discuss in these lectures is going to be BC or BCE. The first was between the Persian Empire and a fragile coalition of Greek polis, or city-states, the Greco-Persian Wars, which began, of course, the causes and antecedents go before that, but in hardcore terms in 490 and lasted till 479, again BCE. And then in the aftermath of that, the war for dominance of at least the eastern Mediterranean, if not the whole of it, between the two leading players on the Greek side in the Persian Wars, the very different polis of Athens and Sparta, which resulted finally, a bit after the war, though the war was an immense contributing factor, in something close to the political collapse of both Athens and Sparta as first-rate political powers. Finally, who succeeded them in the end? In the short term, it was Alexander and the Macedonians, but ultimately it was Rome. And we'll take a look at the war which made of Rome the dominant Mediterranean power, the dominant power of the Western world, a position which it would go on to hold for well more than half a millennium. And that is the series of Punic Wars against the North African trading city and empire of Carthage. These last, the bloodiest and costliest, and in some sense most highly contested wars of antiquity, and indeed, at least arguably, until the 20th century. Our format in this lecture will be first to take a look at exactly how a series of wars which happened at least 2,000 years ago can be said to have made the Western world. We'll then take a look at our sources for the first of these conflicts that we're going to address, the Persian Wars, and then we'll take a look at the players, sort of a lineup card to see what the Persian Empire was like and where it came from, and we'll at least begin to discuss what the Greek polis were like as well. Well, it's not self-evident, to put it mildly, how a series of events that took place at the earliest, 2,100 plus years ago, can be said to have a continuing, and not just continuing, but indeed a decisive effect on how we conceive of ourselves now. How can such a thing be? How did they make the Western world? Well, the answer to that, as I see it, is not only did the wars determine who was going to dominate the Mediterranean cultural hearth, which is where Western culture ultimately comes from, also they represent the occasion when a self-conscious sense of cultural difference, and this has its toxic side effects, no doubt about it, as we are well aware now, but nonetheless, a sense of cultural difference, a sense that we are, not just because we're us, but because our way of life is different, because what we focus on is different. For all sorts of reasons, we are different from, the West is different from, we Hellenes, ultimately we Greco-Romans, ultimately we Westerners, are different from, in what we value, those who are outside the line. Again, this is a kind of a vexatious concept. It goes back, not to get too fancy about it, as far as I can tell, to the Prussian philosopher of the early 19th century, who has the wonderful name of Georg Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel. Hegel, lecturing at Berlin, who claims that we define who we are by differentiating ourselves from an other, from somebody else. To take an obvious example, we look at, say, a cat and say, well, I don't have fur, I don't purr, I sometimes like to eat vegetables, a whole series of differences. Hence, I am not a cat, much as I might like cats. In a more highly loaded cultural context, the West looks at people outside the boundaries of what's conceived as the West and says, well, gee, you know, what? They practice human sacrifice, which, in fact, the Persians didn't, but the Phoenicians did, and regularly. They do X, Y, or Z, whatever it may be. They are not like us, and of course, in every case ever known to me, you can think back to various Western movies of the past 20 years, which show things from the Native American side. And of course, Native Americans don't call themselves Indians, but call themselves, in pretty much all known instances, something which translates as the human beings, or us, or the nice people, and the outsiders in most cultures have names that mean something like the stinkers, or the hairy people, or the bad folks, or something like that. I mean, this is just a cultural universal, a sad one, but so it is. Nonetheless, these wars, the Persian Wars in particular, were instrumental in formulating a sense of Westernness as a cultural touchstone. Westernness is an instance of who we are. A Palestinian who taught for a long time at Columbia, who recently died, named Edward Said, more or less inaugurated what is now known as the whole discipline of neo-colonial studies with a book called Orientalism, which claims something which I would value it differently, but I would be inclined to support, which is that the West is defined over against as different from what he calls the Orient, which is to say the East, which is to say in this original and prototype instance, the Persian Empire. And the way it's formulated right from the outset, when it becomes a concept to which people give allegiance, which people have formulated for themselves, is we Westerners are free, we Westerners are subject to the rule of law, we're also brave and tough, but that's not quite as central. There's plenty of brave and tough Orientals, too, to use the dyslogistic term. And the folks that are on the other side of the line are enslaved, are subject to autocratic governments, and are not subject to law. They're subject to whim, the whim of the ruler. And thus, fighting for our freedom is something worth doing. That, however compromised we may feel about making dismissive judgments of other cultures, is something that we still do believe as Westerners, that we are free in thought, in speech, in our political activities, more or less, and subject to the rule of law, and that is something very much worth fighting for in opposition to tyranny. That conceptualization of the West begins with the Persian Wars, reaches full articulation with the Persian Wars. It fired up the Greeks to victory, and it was a long-shot victory, as we'll see, and it's still very much with us to this day. It's revealing, this is kind of a cultural chestnut. People say this all the time, but it's true for all that. This attitude is revealed sort of in a state of suspension before it crystallized by the Greek word for people who were not Greek. The Greek word for themselves was Hellenes. The word for non-Hellenes was barbaroi, barbarians. And notoriously, it is an insulting and deliberately insulting evocation of the way people who don't talk Greek but talk some dumb other language sound, which is ba, 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 ba. The Greeks, by the way, this is kind of interesting and different from now. We have some misgivings about our unquestioned or more or less unquestioned sense of cultural superiority. The Greeks had virtually none of that. Very few Greeks bothered to learn other languages, and those who did so unwillingly, subject to pressing circumstances, and badly. We'll have occasion as we proceed to see what the Greeks did to the various foreign names they encountered. Anyway, enough on that. We'll have occasion to return to it. It's time now to take a look at our sources for the Persian War, which are fortunately extensive and of very high quality, though some have argued otherwise. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, which is was a city in what is in effect the southwestern corner of the Anatolian Peninsula, in what's now Turkey. It was then very much Greek, Ionian Greek as it happens culturally. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who was born in the mid-480s, at about the time of the Persian Wars, undertook a series of what he called historia, that is to say, investigations. Our word history descends from it, of the war, as he thought of it, between the Greeks and the barbarians. This is interesting in several respects. First, it is the earliest surviving history which we have. He essentially invented the genre. We've lost the works of a predecessor of his called Hecataeus, who had a more geographical focus, and how much he actually owed to Hecataeus, of course, in the absence of Hecataeus, is hard to say. But for our purposes, and likely in substantial measure in any case, history quite literally begins with Herodotus.